I'm Dr. Flux, and welcome back to General Psychology. Last time, we dove deep into the inner workings of the brain, uncovering how lesion studies, split brain research, and brain imaging techniques help us to piece together brain functioning. But today, we're going to take a step back and ask, how does the brain take in information from the world around us? And more importantly, how does it make sense of it? This brings us to the world of sensation and perception, our sixth module in this class. This module explores the raw data your body collects and the interpretive process your brain uses to build your experience of reality. But before we dive into that, let's do some review from our last module. Which part of the nervous system controls reflexes, like pulling your hand away from a hot surface? Is it A, the brain, B, the spinal cord, C, the sympathetic nervous system, or D, the somatic nervous system? If you said B, spinal cord, you nailed it. Reflexes are automatic responses controlled by the spinal cord to keep you safe in situations where speed matters. Which patient case helps scientists understand the role of the hippocampus in making new memories? Is it A, Phineas Gage, B, HM, C, split brain patients, or D, Broca's aphasia? B, patient HM is the correct answer here. Bilateral lesions of his hippocampus did help to stop his seizures, but they also stopped him from being able to make new memories, inducing anterograde amnesia. Today, we're going to explore how your brain takes sensory data and transforms it into the rich, complex world that you experience every day. We'll be taking a look at the differences between sensation, the raw data, and perception, the brain's interpretation, how the brain uses bottom-up and top-down processing to create models of reality, why perception is subjective and how illusions reveal the brain's modeling processes, the role of Gestalt principles in organizing sensory information into meaningful patterns, and then we'll finish up with conclusion and review. I feel like you're probably getting tired of me saying this, but this unit will again deeply lean on my favorite quote, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." I want you to think of your brain as a model-making machine. Every time you see, hear, or feel something, your brain is creating a model of what it thinks is happening. But here's the catch. These models are never perfect. Your brain doesn't give you a direct feed to reality. It gives you its best guess based on the information that it has. So as we dive into sensation and perception, think about how your brain is constantly building models of the world. Hopefully useful ones, but always a little off from the full picture. All right, let's get started with the basics. Sensation and perception. These two processes are the foundation of how you experience the world around you. Sensation is the process of detecting information from the environment, like light hitting your eye, sound waves entering your ears, or pressure on your skin. Perception, on the other hand, is how your brain interprets that sensory information, how it turns it into something useful, like recognizing a friend's face, hearing your favorite song, or maybe feeling warmth of sunlight on your skin. Think of it like this. Sensation is the raw data, and perception is the story your brain tells you about that data. Let's take a look at the upside-down world of vision as an example. Okay, no, maybe not that upside down. All right, when light enters your eye, it hits the back of your retina and forms an upside-down image. That's sensation, the raw data that your eye collects. But you don't walk around seeing the world upside down. At least I don't think you do. That's because your brain steps in and flips the image right side up. That's perception, your brain's interpretation of that sensory data. Without perception, you'd be stuck with a jumbled mess of sights, sounds, and sensations. It's perception that gives that raw data meaning. Let's take a look at another example. Hearing. Sensation happens when sound waves enter your ear and cause tiny bones in your middle ear to vibrate. That's just the raw data of vibrations moving through the air. But your brain doesn't just hear vibrations. It hears music, voices, laughter, and language. That's perception. Your brain interpreting those vibrations and giving them meaning. Here's the key idea, though. Perception isn't reality. It's your brain's best guess at what's happening outside of your body. Your brain takes incomplete sensory data and builds a model of reality from it. Sometimes that model is useful, other times it gets things a bit wrong. Your perception of the world isn't perfect, but it's useful enough to help you navigate your environment, make decisions, and stay alive. Let's do a quick attention check. Which of the following best describes perception? Is it A, detection of stimuli by sensory organs? B, interpretation of sensory information by the brain? C, the raw data from the environment? Or D, the movement of sound waves through the ear canal? If you picked B, you've got it. Perception is all about how your brain interprets the sensory data it receives. It's the difference between seeing lines and shapes on a page and recognizing them as words that carry meaning. Let's take a moment to reflect. Have you ever thought you heard someone call your name when no one was there? Or have you ever seen something out of the corner of your eye that turned out to be nothing? Maybe you misread a text message and thought someone was upset with you when they weren't. These are all examples of your brain's model of reality getting it almost right, but not quite. Your brain is constantly making assumptions and filling in gaps, and sometimes that leads to perceptual errors. But remember, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Your perception doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good enough to keep you moving through the world successfully. Now that we've covered the basics of sensation and perception, let's look at how your brain builds its model of reality, because it does this in two different ways. Let's start with bottom-up processing. This is where perception begins with that raw data from your senses that's collected from the environment. It's a data-driven process. Your brain builds a model of reality from the ground up, without relying on any prior knowledge or expectations. Imagine you see a strange object that you've never encountered before. You don't know what it is, but you start to notice its shape, color, and texture. Your brain is trying to figure out what it might be based on the sensory input that you're receiving. That's bottom-up processing in action. Now, what about top-down processing, when your brain brings in prior knowledge and experiences to help interpret that information? Let's take a look at an incomplete sentence. Can you read this sentence with missing letters? This sentence makes sense even though some letters are missing. Even though some of those letters weren't there, your brain fills in the gaps because it expects sentences to make sense. We have a prior expectation of what those words are. That's top-down processing. It's your brain using what it already knows to make sense of incomplete information. Let's try a fun example to see how bottom-up and top-down processing can work together. Check out this image. Can you make out what it is? At first, it probably looks like a random collection of black and white lines and shapes. That's your bottom-up processing trying to make sense of the raw data. But if you stare at it for a moment, you might suddenly recognize a familiar shape. Let's take a look at the photo that it's based on. As you can see here, it's a bumblebee. Now let's go back to that black and white image. Once your brain sees it, you can't unsee it. That's top-down processing kicking in. Your brain is using its knowledge of what a bee looks like to fill in the gaps. This is a perfect example of how your brain's model of reality can change as new information is received. Your brain is constantly combining bottom-up and top-down processing to create a model of reality. Bottom-up processing gives you the raw data. Top-down processing fills in the gaps. This process often goes back and forth as we try to understand the world like a scientist. But here's the thing. These expectations can also lead to errors. Your brain's model isn't perfect, but it's useful. It helps you navigate the world, even if it doesn't get everything right. And some of the models we come up with will be more useful than others. Before we move on to that, though, let's do a quick attention check. Which of the following is an example of top-down processing? Is it A, noticing the smell of fresh coffee for the first time? B, recognizing a familiar face in a blurry photo? C, feeling the warmth of sunlight on your skin? Or D, hearing a sudden loud noise and turning your head? If you picked B, you're right. Top-down processing is all about using your prior knowledge and expectations to interpret sensory data, like recognizing a familiar face even if the image might not be that clear. So far we've talked about how your brain combines raw sensory data with prior knowledge to create a model of reality. But what happens when that model doesn't match what's out there very well? That's where perceptual illusions come in. Illusions are like little glitches in your brain's model of the world. They reveal how your brain fills in gaps, makes assumptions, and sometimes gets it wrong. Do you recognize this image? In 2015, the internet lost its mind over what color this dress was. It was an example of a perceptual illusion deeply grounded in the way that the brain processes visual information. Perceptual illusions like this happen because your brain is trying to make sense of the world quickly and as efficiently as possible. It often takes shortcuts and makes assumptions to fill in the blanks. Most of the time this works really well, but sometimes these shortcuts misfire, and you end up seeing or hearing something that doesn't quite match up. These illusions are a reminder that your perception isn't a direct reflection of the world. It's your brain's best guess. Let's start with a simple example that you can try on your own: your blind spot. Everyone has a spot in their vision where the optic nerve connects at the back of the eye. There's no photoreceptors in this spot, which means that you shouldn't be able to see anything there. But here's the wild part. You don't walk around seeing a black hole in your vision. Why's that? Well, your brain fills in the gaps with information from the surrounding area. Let's try it out. Close one eye and focus on this dot. Slowly move your head back and forth, and you'll notice that the nearby shape disappears when it hits your blind spot. But your brain doesn't let you see nothing. It patches that hole without you ever realizing it. That's an example of perception at work. Now, let's take a look at some famous optical illusions that show how easily your brain's model of reality can be tricked. First, let's take a look at the checker shadow illusion. In this illusion, two squares on a checkerboard look like they're different shades of gray. One looks light and one looks dark. But here's the mind-bending part. They're actually the same color. Your brain is factoring in the shadow and adjusting the colors based on what it expects to see. Another famous illusion is the Ames room. This is a specifically designed room that messes with your brain's perception of size and space. People standing in different parts of the room appear to grow or shrink, even though they're staying the same size. Your brain assumes the room is normal, so it builds a model that doesn't quite match the reality. After images are another great example of how the way that your brain processes information can sometimes lead us astray. If you stare at a bright image for a while and then suddenly shift your attention, you can sometimes see a ghost image in complementary colors. This happens because your photoreceptors get fatigued and your brain overcompensates when you shift your gaze. Let's use this image as an example. Stare at the center of this inverted color image, and then I'll switch the screen after a few seconds. Did it look like this black and white image was in color briefly? That's an example of an afterimage, and it's based off of the way that photoreceptors in your eyes work. Here, we saw some examples about how the way that the brain processes information can skew our understanding of the world. And this is at play in every single person. Each of us has a slightly different way of perceiving the world. For example, some people are colorblind, which means that they can't perceive certain colors because of differences in their photoreceptors. This impacts the way that their perception ties together the raw information coming from their eyes. Additionally, cultural differences can play a role in the way that we interpret information. People from different cultures may interpret visual information differently based on their experiences and their environments. Even the simple way that you interpret an optical illusion can sometimes vary depending on your background and expectations. Your brain's model of reality is uniquely yours. Remember, your brain is constantly building this model based off of incomplete information. It's filling in gaps, making assumptions, and trying to create a continuous and coherent picture that you never think about. But sometimes those assumptions lead you astray. These illusions are reminders that our perception isn't perfect. It's just your brain's best guess. Let's take another moment to reflect. Think about a time when you saw something differently from someone that you know. How could the way that your brain generates perception have played a role? At this point, we've explored how the brain processes raw sensory data, how it applies both bottom-up and top-down processing, and how illusions can reveal some of the quirks of our perception. But how does your brain take a chaotic mess of sensory information and turn it into a structured and meaningful experience? One of the ways that psychologists have looked at this is through Gestalt principles, rules that your brain follows to organize information in ways that help you make sense of the world. The Gestalt school of psychology emerged in the early 20th century with one fundamental idea: the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Your brain isn't just a passive receiver of individual bits of sensory information, it's an active organizer. Instead of seeing separate lines and shapes, you see a complete image, and instead of hearing isolated noises, you can hear a melody. Gestalt principles explain how your brain does this. They're shortcuts and assumptions that your mind uses to group elements together and build a coherent perception of the world. One of the first things your brain does when interpreting a scene is decide what's the figure and what's the ground. This allows you to separate an object from its background. Take a look at this image. Do you see a vase, or do you see two faces? Your brain can flip between the two interpretations because it needs to decide which one is the figure and which one is in the background. Let's take a look at another principle. Imagine a bunch of dots on a page. If they're evenly spaced, you might just see random dots, but if they're clustered together, your brain might group them into a pattern. This is the principle of proximity. Things that are close together are seen as belonging together. In this image, the proximity of the dots influences whether we mentally organize them vertically or horizontally. Another principle in Gestalt psychology is similarity. Your brain assumes that things that look alike probably go together. For example, look at these shapes. We tend to group the circles together as an arrow because they're more similar than the gray squares. And this principle is everywhere. Why do sports teams wear matching uniforms? Part of this is so that your brain can quickly recognize who's on which team. Without this principle, a Buffs football game would be visual chaos. Another principle is continuity. Your brain prefers things to be smooth and continuous. If something can be interpreted as a flowing line or a pattern, that's usually how you'll see it. Look at this X. You generally see two lines crossing, right? But technically, you could break this apart in multiple different ways. Your brain just prefers the smooth and continuous, unbroken explanation. This is one of the reasons why cursive handwriting works. Your brain can follow the smooth strokes and allow you to read words. This is another Gestalt principle. Your brain hates gaps. If something is missing, it fills in the blanks to create a complete picture. Take a look at this image. There's no actual triangle here, but your brain fills in the missing edges to complete the shapes. All right, let's bring it all together. Today we explored how your brain takes raw sensory data and transforms it into the rich, complex world that you experience every day. We took a look at sensation, the raw information that your senses collect from the environment, and perception, how your brain interprets that information to create meaning. We explored the role of bottom-up and top-down processing in shaping your reality. We took a look at some perceptual illusions that reveal some flaws in how your brain models the world. And finally, we took a look at Gestalt principles, which help to organize sensory information into coherent patterns. But if there's one big takeaway from today, it's this. Your perception of reality isn't a perfect reflection of the world. It's your brain's best guess. As I mentioned at the outset, your brain is a model-making machine. It takes incomplete sensory data, fills in the gaps with expectations and prior knowledge, and organizes everything into a coherent and continuous picture of the world. But these models are never perfect. They're useful because they help us to navigate the world around us. They help us to recognize patterns and make quick decisions. But they're also prone to errors. And again, that brings us back to George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Your brain's version of reality might not be the perfect reflection of what's out there, but it's often good enough to help you to thrive in a complex and ever-changing world. Let's do some review before we wrap up. Which process involves the brain interpreting and organizing sensory information? Is it A, sensation, B, perception, C, reflex, or D, adaptation? The correct answer here is B, perception. Our perception organizes our sensation into usable patterns. Which of the following is an example of bottom-up processing? A, recognizing an unfamiliar object based on its shape and color, B, filling in missing letters in a word, C, recognizing a song from the first few notes, or D, identifying a face in the crowd. If you chose A, you're correct. Bottom-up processing makes use of sensory information, not prior knowledge that we may have had. Your perception isn't fixed. It's always adapting, shifting, and evolving. The more we learn about how your brain processes the world, the more we realize that our understanding of reality isn't necessarily what's out there. It's a collaboration between the external world and our brain's internal modeling system. Your brain's model of reality might not be perfect, but it's the best tool you've got to navigate a world that's always in flux. So until next time, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. I'll see you in the next lecture.